Hello, welcome again to Sport Unlocked, bringing you all the week's sports news analysed. And as ever, if you hit subscribe, we land in your feeds automatically. Joining me, Rob Harris from Sky News as ever, Martyn Ziegler from The Times, and Tariq Panja from The New York Times. Well, we were all in Monaco last week, and really the big sort of talking point, although not addressed by many, it seems, was, of course, the fallout from Luis Rubiales and that non-consensual kiss on Jenny Hermoso. And it really still is dominating globally beyond sport as well, isn't it?
After we recorded, we had the England head coach Sarina Wiegman speaking about it quite sort of memorably. And actually, well, this week we've had the Spain national team manager of the women's team, Jorge Vilda, has been sacked. The RFEF, the Spanish FA, have sort of distanced themselves from Rubiales. So yeah, it's still keeping going, isn't it? I mean, I think, and we've also had Hermoso launching a criminal complaint about what happened after the World Cup final in Sydney. So, yeah, it's still going on, and it's still causing sort of significant waves, I think, in football.
And the Vilda firing was notable, perhaps for the statement, which said that they decided for a change in direction with this new board, but at the same time, praising his leadership, praising the values and all his success, of course, winning the World Cup, the youth titles as well. So no criticism of him. And then Vilda goes on Spanish radio to call it unfair. And of course, even a year before the World Cup, all the concerns of 15 Spanish players about his leadership.
Yeah, it was almost as though he'd written that farewell statement himself, because all those issues you mentioned weren't touched at all. None of the preceding years of scandal, as you said, the 15 players quitting and other bits and pieces. And then this is a guy that they're trying to turn over a new leaf and sort of move on without him. And to be honest, he couldn't have carried on anyway. One, the players have refused to play, and all of his coaches had quit by the time that announcement was made, wasn't it? So it's kind of an extremely untenable position for this guy to be in. I mean, it's the fact that they won the World Cup is remarkable in that context, isn't it?
Yeah, it certainly shows it was the players which did it. You would say, but one of my colleagues, Matthew Sides, written a sort of fairly counterintuitive column saying that he thought it was shameful that Vilda was sacked for basically, he said, for applauding Rubiales at a Spanish FA meeting. But I mean, I think we should probably make clear things have gone on with him and the players for much longer than that, haven't they? So there were loads of issues last year, weren't there, which led to he basically excluded 12 players from his World Cup squad.
And Tariq, that column also suggesting he was writing not from a position of knowledge.
Yeah, that was the odd thing. He I think, I don't want to misquote him here, but he sort of said he doesn't know the ins and outs of it all. And look, if you don't know the ins and outs of it, well, how could you be so emphatic in writing this? The whole thing is, the ins and outs of it are that there's a whole history and catalogue of problems well beyond this moment of winning the World Cup. The fact that said the coaches aren't playing. Vilda is Rubiales' man. The fact he was there applauding Rubiales in the room when he refused to quit less than a week ago. All of these things. I mean, it's strange to kind of write such a emphatic piece and then also include the fact that you're not really sure about the ins and outs of it. But I think that line was then subsequently deleted from the copy, which was also kind of odd.
Yeah, obviously questions for the media as much as often we'll be calling out the officials in football. And that is something that was notable, wasn't it? The fact in Monaco, we had that powerful moment when Sarina Wiegman, as England manager after collecting award, did dedicate it to the Spanish team and talked about the various challenges being faced in Spain. And also we had Antana Bonmati as well when she collected the Women's Player of the Year award using her platform too. But then none of the men who got up on stage used their presence. Now, of course, not having to call out Rubiales directly, but I think perhaps missing a moment of solidarity and to be seen saying so on camera.
Yeah, just from a kind of in the moment perspective, if you want, if Aitana Bonmati has said what she had, and as if Serena Wiegman has said that there were male winners, not to single out Erling Haaland, but he's the nearest comparison because he won the men's award and she won the women's award. They're standing next to each other on stage. She's made that point. Maybe it's worth I don't know, backing it or offering some support, because that story was dominating not just the sports news but almost all news all over the world for a week or so before the awards. I mean, it's funny. Why? It's very rare that the men speak out on many things. Really, the women's football, they often have to have the role of activists, not least just to play football, but other issues as well. It's kind of noticeable that the difference more broadly, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think we were left almost in no uncertain terms around UEFA that this is not something that should be overshadowing the awards, the draw, the ceremony, and something they didn't believe needed to be a talking point. Is very much something that was a Spanish issue, not a European-wide issue, or something that actually warranted a sort of global moment of solidarity.
I mean, I think if you've reported on men's football as long as I have, then it's a sort of the safe position which public relations officers will favour and no doubt push players, managers is to try and avoid controversy. Take the safe option, won't they? And I'm sure that's the case here.
But Robert, it's not just the players as well. I just think it's a moment for leadership, isn't it? More broadly, like this stuff has happened. It's such a kind of moment, pivotal moment, and people kind of have to be seen to be counted, particularly the big football leaders. And I don't think we've seen enough of that or much of that, unless they're kind of pushed to say something.
And we had Gianni Infantino on Instagram, and he didn't actually name, Rubiales in that. I don't think he named Jenny Hermoso as well in the statements. At least it was saying something, but it took over a week and a half after the incident took place in Sydney at the World Cup final, a moment that Hermoso says was non-consensual. It was an act against her.
I think it's going to be one which people look back on how to handle these sorts of situations in the future. They will. Any sort of public relations analyst would say a lot of people got a lot of things wrong.
And at the time of recording, Luis Rubiales is yet to officially stand down as Spanish Federation president, suspended currently by FIFA while their investigation is conducted, and Hermoso herself has now filed the criminal complaint. Well, reflecting on some of the media coverage, and one of the parts of the media coverage, of course, on Spain is highlighted by how male-dominated football media is still. There's been a bit of media focus on one particular interview in the last week. Jordan Henderson breaking silence over his move to Saudi Arabia, to Al Ettifaq, and choosing to give the interview to The Athletic. Certainly asked all the questions that were being asked. What do we think of some of the answers? Much to unpick, not only on Saudi, but also his references to Qatar. But I suppose trying to say it wasn't about the money.
At least he did something. He could not have done anything and tried to let the dust settle. So at least give Jordan Henderson credit for answering all the questions and doing a long interview. I did think some of the things didn't quite ring true to me. Like he said, he'd heard all these things about migrant workers in Qatar, but actually when he got out himself and was shown how they their living conditions, he felt like it was a different story. But I think he may not have realised that actually these were sort of specially selected migrant workers who are basically paraded by FIFA and the organising committee for people to see. And I think that did come across as slightly naive.
It was listed as an official activity on the plans, wasn't it, at the World Cup? Originally, it was portrayed in the build-up to the World Cup that they would go out and meet migrant workers while there. We weren't given the impression it was going to be an official event, effectively authorise migrant workers.
Yeah, so what? Training, lunch, meet migrant worker, nap. Yeah, exactly. The questions were really good from Adam Crafton and David Ornstein. They kind of asked all the right questions, and you should expect that. But the answers were just, the charitable part is maybe he's naive. and then the rest of it was just so excruciating to go through that transcript in what he was saying. There was a particular line about, not that it just wasn't about the money, that it was about the project. And you're like, what? Why would this project to grow football in Saudi Arabia attract you now? There are all sorts of other football projects that are perhaps worthy of being involved in, if that's what's floating your boat. And the whole point is, this whole thing has been about money. Ask all of these players, they're getting contracts they've never had in their lives, and they're heading over there. The idea that anyone would believe that as well. I mean, I don't. Maybe if you say it enough times, maybe he believes it. I just think it was just felt like nonsense. And then it reminded me of the golfers, Rob. You know, we were at that first Live Golf event in London near St Albans a couple of years ago, and I think it was Graham McDowell was talking about how he's not a politician, how they're just a football player, and it's about growing the game of golf in Saudi Arabia. It just seemed very similar. The idea that he wasn't prepared is also very hard to believe.
Yeah, perhaps the difference was a year later when I went back to Live, they started to talk more about the money is part of the reason for joining up with Live at the time. But people in the media do also move for money as well. So it's not completely alien concept in many jobs. Obviously, with Saudi, we're talking about, huge amounts of money. Although, essentially, he denied the £700,000 a week number, I think it is. Of course, easy to deny because, of course, even if it was 699,000 a week, I don't think they explored the exact range of the numbers on offer there. But I suppose he didn't really have answers that might have alleviated the concerns of some that he was completely disregarding values he'd championed previously.
There are players who have. Tony Kroos has come out. He had an offer from Saudi Arabia, and he said he had to turn it down for that very reason. They don't chime with his values, and you have to wonder where the line is. Jordan Henderson's a particular case because he's not just another football player. He made such a big point of being an ally to the LGBTQ community in the kind of latter part of his career, the run up to Qatar and all the rest of it. That's why he's such a name, and that's why he's had the criticism he has. It might have just been better for him to just shut up and go and play football over there and earn loads of money, because what's the point?
I was actually wondering if there was a parallel path where he'd sort of got the okay from them in Saudi to wear rainbow laces for his first training session or his first game. So it would have seemed like he'd acknowledged something. Then there could have been an alternative discussion, which is actually it's just a meaningless symbolic gesture. Is not spoken out. Is it enough just to wear rainbow laces? But perhaps at least acknowledging it, and also the Saudis to realise it might take the heat off if he was just seen to do something that ultimately they didn't even need to show the images of domestically. It might have helped his situation.
Well, I think we saw from what happened in Qatar that they're so adamant about wearing the rainbow armbands that was never going to be allowed. So even if that had attempted to explore that, it was that would. Can you imagine that happening? I mean,
well, we know it can't happen because don't you remember his announcement on social media where it all turned into grayscale. So any kind of sign of anything resembling a rainbow was essentially blacked out.
But we are in very sort of delicate territory as well, that this is different from asking countries to change worker rights, to even improve women's rights, things like removing male guardianship. This is actually telling them to not follow perhaps parts of the religion.
I don't know. It's to me, it's much broader than that. Anyway, it's about people being thrown into prison for writing pro-democracy things on Twitter, or it's not just about the homosexuality of gay rights. I think it's everything, which for me leaves a bad taste in the mouth with anybody going to Saudi Arabia.
There was something else sort of drawn out from his answers where he talks about respecting culture. And then some people sort of taking odds with the referencing being LGBTQ as part of culture rather than part of who they are.
I think that's ultimately the point here, isn't it? Whether it's that or point Zieg's just raised there has to be some kind of basic respect for universal human values, right? Otherwise, we say, what about this? What about that? What about this one? What about, they don't like left-footed players or right-footed players? Oh, that's their culture. It's not about that. There has to be like some basic things that people agree on. Slinging someone in jail or chucking someone off a roof for who they are or whatever that is, it's just, surely there's a line. And this guy, this dude in particular, has talked about these issues and made a point. I mean, Jordan Henderson, in a way, maybe Thomas Hitzelsberger made a point, and whether it's true or not, former football player, he came out as gay after he retired, German international, and he said, his fear was that Jordan Henderson, his adoption of this cause, was a part of what he felt was maybe a brand building exercise for Jordan Henderson. That would be really sad if that's the case.
And when we do talk about this, it actually place it purely back in the football context. It's FIFA's own statutes who talk about no discrimination based on, amongst other things, sexual orientation. They say it's strictly prohibited.
Yeah. Well, he's had support though, hasn't he? For all the criticism, there's been like support from his perspective. I saw Brendan Rodgers, the Celtic manager, he was on radio in Britain on Talk Sport saying the players have to do what's right for them, and then pretty much having a go at people like us, I suppose, for raising this, saying there's so many morality officers nowadays that are judging people. So in Brendan Rodgers' view, people just go and do what you want, no questions asked, because these people aren't role models or anything else. They're people who are free to do whatever they like, and they are. Certainly, they're free to do whatever they like, certainly in countries where we're recording this from, maybe not in Saudi Arabia, but and it's up to them what choices they make.
You don't want to rule out potential coaching options, perhaps for Brendan Rodgers.
Yeah.
As I got the sense speaking to Damien Comoli in Monaco after the Europa League draw, it's actually quite a good extensive interview that we did about transfers and the Saudi situation broadly. He said actually anyone who's saying that Saudi Arabia doesn't pose a threat to the likes of the Premier League is, lying to themselves and they're not quite realising it. Very sort of talking up Saudi, while also at the same time saying he thinks still the chosen pathway still for a young French player, for instance, would be going to the Premier League or La Liga and then later on to Saudi still. So still wanting to experience those large European leagues first.
I think that, yeah. I mean, I would agree with that with Comoli. I still don't think it's a big threat. I think it's a destabilising thing for football, for European football, just because you can, a club can suddenly find themselves in the lucky situation of having a huge amount of money in their bank account, which they weren't perhaps budgeting for, and that is it gives them a competitive advantage over another. I don't see it as a threat per se, but definitely destabilising.
Damien Comoli, of course, formerly of Arsenal, Tottenham, Liverpool, now president at Toulouse. And you talk about destabilising. Some should say the wealth of the Premier League to some might be seen as destabilising if they suddenly perhaps give a lot of money to a particular club in Europe from a player they're buying or their ability to attract talent too. So not purely a Saudi thing.
Yeah, like we've said this before, when we talk about the big five leagues, we say there's only one really big league, and that's the Premier League, where teams like Bournemouth are able to outspend, everyone else in Europe beyond Real Madrid and things like this. But the thing with the Saudi question is, I think Comoli also, when he was doing the rounds that day, he made a good point as well. He said it's really the biggest teams that are the most affected by this. For the rest of Europe, because they're not after a lot of players from like mid-ranking teams, they're not that badly affected. But one thing that caught my eye, that bid for Mohamed Salah from Etihad, which is one of those teams that is controlled by the Public Investment Fund, which also owns Newcastle in the Premier League. The bid was made after the last day of the transfer window, and now it's still going on. If Mohamed Salah is heads turned, etc., Newcastle, one of the teams that are owned by PIF, inadvertently benefit from this. And then you get to this question of, multi-club ownership and the power of PIF on the Premier League. It just becomes very messy, very knotty and complicated as well in different ways.
Well, moving on to the wider European football landscape and a new agreement with UEFA and the European Club Association, all about how the money is distributed from the Champions League revenue and actually who gets the fruits of the funding. Is it the established clubs? Is it those most successful in the likes of the Champions League? Or is it those who actually don't qualify for European competitions to try to ensure some sort of a competitive balance, or in that direction at least? So what was the exact agreement that was announced this week by the ECA?
So it's sort of different strands, really. But I suppose for the solidarity payments, they're called, to the smaller clubs, the ones who don't get to the Champions League, that's going to go up from 2024. It's going to be basically 10% of the pot will go to those, which is I guess, a significant increase. But I think perhaps the most interesting thing for me is they're going to change the way that the funding for the biggest clubs is going to be arranged. So the coefficient funding, which has been 30% of the total money for the Champions League, has been since 2017 allocated on a club's 10-year performance in Europe over the last 10 years and the number of European trophies it has. Now, the change to this is that it's going to go down to 5 years, not 10. And also there will be less money. We don't know exactly how much, but it's something like about 10% less. So what it will mean probably is that Real Madrid, Barcelona, Juventus, who've sort of benefited from their sort of status in Europe, a number of trophies and their 10-year performances, are going to get less. Manchester City have done well recently. Bayern Munich, they will get more. So maybe, I don't know, do you think this is a Super League rebels getting hit in the pocket, Tariq?
Surely not, Ziegs. No one will be that vindictive. But their memories are like elephants, I suppose, about at UEFA about what had happened, and these were the three holdouts. It's kind of curious that this has happened. I'm not sure there'll be too many tears shed about 10-year coefficients, though, not being part of this equation. It seems that this general agreement more broadly seems a lot more equitable than the one that was hurried through the last time. And if you remember that, the circumstances around that, UEFA essentially had no leadership. It was after the FIFA scandal, and it was all hurried through. This one has taken a lot longer. There is a lot more money for teams that aren't in Europe and the smaller teams. This feels a bit more of an equitable agreement. I think most people are happy with the outcome.
So what it actually means, for instance, all teams who qualify for the Champions League will get 27.5% of the prize money rather than 25% as it is currently, for instance. And then the performance bonuses, as they progress through, rises to 37.5%, and it's currently at 30%. That's as you sort of get through from the group stage. Of course, we get the new bigger Champions League next season, going from 32 to 36 teams with a lot of games. Also at the ECA, some election news as well. Who's going to be sitting on the ECA board helping to run the show now?
Mr. Ferran Soriano from Manchester City, I think, is going to be on there. He's been on there before, but I think he was forced to sort of step down after the Super League thing, but now he's back.
He is back, and it seems like everyone's friends again, certainly at European level. Don't forget, it was UEFA that attempted, or certainly the people who are running the disciplinary organs for FFP were trying to ban Manchester City for 2 years for financial fair play breaches. Manchester City won, back in the fold. One of the first clubs to turn their backs on the Super League. Closer to UEFA perhaps than they've ever been before, and now in the decision-making body of the ECA. It's funny how fortunes turn. Speaking of financial fair play, didn't you have a story this week on the Premier League and how it will handle FFP cases?
Yeah, an interesting thing which was slipped into the Premier League handbook, wasn't announced at the time the decision was taken in June, but it's there in black and white in the handbook suddenly that for financial fair play breaches, there's going to be a 12-week deadline for the cases to be brought against a club this season, dealt with, and any appeal heard. So clubs will now have to submit accounts by December the 31st. A decision taken within 2 weeks on whether they've breached the rules and then dealt with before the start of the season. So, for example, Everton last season, they were charged. There were lots of clubs unhappy. They that sort of has rolled over to this October, so that any sanction that they get won't apply to last season. So, for example, Leeds United probably felt, and others who were relegated felt that if they had a points deduction, it should have affected last season, and then perhaps they could have stayed up.
Yeah, but that big legacy case as well, not just Everton. Manchester City's case opened in 2018. There was a ruling a year ago, and now there's the disciplinary panel. I think it's 5 years almost now since Manchester City's FFP case. And just to remind people, that's 115 charges that they deny, Martyn. Is that something different then?
Yeah, so that is getting viewed according to the handbook. That would be, it doesn't specify Manchester City, but it does say that exceptional circumstances would be multiple breaches over multiple years. So, for example, that if Chelsea, if it gets charged because there's an investigation that we've talked about previously into payments to offshore companies, that's over a 6-year period going back to 2012. That again wouldn't be subject to the 12-week deadline because it's multiple years and potentially multiple offences if that gets brought.
And of course, these rules aren't just unilaterally imposed by the Premier League. It's the clubs who ultimately agree to these themselves, isn't it?
Yeah, they are the owners of the league, aren't they, Martyn? So it's a club-run organisation. Just to move on to something just before we finish, it's been another bad week for Manchester United, hasn't it? And the people who run the club, guys, a couple of issues. One involving Anthony, the Brazilian winger, dropped from Brazil after his girlfriend or ex-girlfriend complained to Brazilian authorities and police in Manchester, I think, are aware of this, about being allegedly assaulted by him in a hotel room in Manchester. And then there's this story this week in the Daily Mail, and I'll just read the headline, which was quite stunning. Manchester United made convicted paedophile Jeff Konopka guest of honour at Old Trafford and celebrated his career, despite him being banned from the game. Club, in quotes, were unaware ex-women's coach got 4 years for offences against girls. Guys, what is going on there?
Yeah, it's. I mean, after all the Mason Greenwood stuff, got Anthony subject to similar allegations, which he denies, but even so, it puts the club in a very difficult position. And as far as we know, when we've at time of recording, they've not dropped him from the squad as yet. So you must, if you were like the chief executive of Richard Arnold, you must think, as Mario Balotelli once famously said, "Why always me?"
And of course, this in a week when more news on the Manchester United on-off takeover. What's happening with that? A report not publicly denied that they're no longer looking to sell the club, something I've not stood up, but it was by Nick Harris in the Mail on Sunday. It led to a huge drop in the share price initially. And I suppose it's very separate from the, deepening concerns about conduct, the sale process. But perhaps it is pointing to that questions over the leadership, the direction of the club, the stability of the actual way things are being run.
Yeah, it's a question about culture and Manchester United drifting as well, and straightforward decisions being hard to make, whether it's to do with these very awful off-the-field matters that we discussed, or whether the sale process. It all just seems very kind of messy. Rob, that share price drop was enormous, wasn't it? It was $500 million was wiped off. I mean, a lot of that was speculative money piling in the hope that Manchester United would be sold for a king or a sheikh's ransom, and then that hasn't turned out to be the case. That doesn't mean if someone comes in with a massive offer, just because this idea of Manchester United is quote, off the market. None of these clubs are ever off the market, are they? If someone comes with a big check and there's an owner willing to sell, then the club's going to be sold, isn't it?
That's true. And also, just to make out, the share price is still considerably higher than last December when they first, or November, December when they first announced that they would consider selling the club. So it's not that much of a drop. Big, yeah, but I'm sure the Glazers won't be too unhappy.
Well, it seems we've been talking about that for a long time on the pod. Well, that about brings an end to this week's episode of Sport Unlocked. As ever, your feedback welcome at Sport Unlocked on all the social media platforms, sportunlockedpod@gmail.com. And if you hit subscribe, then we land in that feed automatically, and always gratefully if you can hit rate. It's all anonymous, or review us if you want to be a bit more public on the platform of your pod of choice to give us a bit of feedback. But for now, thank you for listening. Goodbye.